The RPG Cave's mana is fueled by patrons at patreon.com/YumiCapri, and we want to say thank you to everyone for all of their support, including our Capremium producers, Dallas Ford, Drew Agnew from the House of Mario podcast, Jace Baldridge from twitch.tv/Baka Ridge, Lee Navarro, the fearless leader of the Phoenix Overdrive Extra Life team, and Jonathan Brown over at youtube.com/GamingPurpleMonkey. Our platinum producers, Brian Scott, Robbie Miller, and Trucker Sloth. Our gold members, Argo, Brendan Myers, Dallas Robbins, Emily O'Kelly, Heather Boney, James Johnson, Joel Brooks, Jose Jimenez, Mac Time, Benji Kong, Marcus O'Neill, RJ Kern, Dano, Skinny Matt, and Xavier Reyes. Thank you all for all of your support. Now, on with the show. Greetings, fellow travelers. Welcome to the 4th level of the RPG Cave. I'm your level 99 human Archmage, and I'm joined, as always, by the level 99 Elf Ranger, Mr. Garret Bland, the blandest of explosions. Garret, how you doing today, buddy?
Oh, I'm doing great. I actually woke up late, so this is not my second cup. This is my first cup of coffee. I'm still waking up, and but I'm doing really well. I'm ready to talk some more RPGs.
That's good. I know it's been a long week for you. I think you're doing jury duty this week, right?
It was all court. It ended Thursday, thank goodness, and I don't have to deal with it anymore.
Oh, thank God. Oh man, that sucks. Well, obviously, of course, this is not a jury duty podcast. This is an RPG podcast where we talk about RPGs, except for right now. So let's clear the dungeon of those pesky mobs and talk about what's going on with this show. Of course, if you like what we do, please consider subscribing to us right here on YouTube. Just search the RPG Cave on YouTube, or if you're listening to us on audio feeds and you want to support us that way as well, again, you can just click the link in the show notes and it'll bring you right to the YouTube page. You can check us out there. Because again, a video version of the podcast comes out every Saturday, so we encourage you, of course, to check us out there. Not only that, but other things will be coming to the YouTube channel this month, and that's all I'm going to say about that, because we are playing some stuff for that are going to go up there. Of course, though, if you would also like to support what we do, you can continue supporting us over on patreon.com/YumiCapri. Throw a little tip in the old tip jar. You get this show early, as well as other exclusive content or all of our shows early over there on Patreon as well. If you would like to do that, you can definitely go do that. Also, last bit of housekeeping before we get into the show proper. Next week, Garret, is E3 because, and I should say next week, although honestly, when you're listening to this, it'll be this week because we record these a week in advance. But next week, Garret and I are going to be super busy during E3. We actually are not going to be able to make our normal recording time. So there's going to be a little bit of a lull between this episode that you're listening to today and then when the next episode comes out, because essentially we'll be recording our next episode on the 19th, provided there's no changes. But the upside is that even though you have to wait, a little bit longer for the next episode, we'll turn that episode around much quicker. So basically, as soon as we finish recording it, that afternoon or the next day, we'll have that episode up. But then you'll have a little bit more time between that and the next episode. So just wanted to throw it out there that if the release schedule seems a little bit weird for the next couple weeks, it's all E3's fault. You can blame E3 for this because darn you, E3. I know Garrett's going to be busy over on Shaq as well as his own stuff. And then Sean and I are going to be streaming a lot of the press conferences. During our normal recording time next week, the Xbox conference is happening. So obviously we're
all going to be paying attention towards that.
Yeah, exactly.
Isn't the next episode Chrono Trigger? Is that the one that we're doing next?
No, so the next episode is going to be our kind of reactions to E3.
Reactions to E3.
As well as going over predictions. Because we're gonna grade ourselves, Garret. We're gonna see who had the better predictions.
Oh, we'll see.
But 2 episodes from now will be the Chrono Trigger episode, because I know you're chomping at the bit to talk about that one.
I was staying up late last night, and that's why I slept in. I stay up late beating this game. I'm there.
Oh, it's over. You beat it?
I'm at the I'm confronting lava. It's like I'm right in front of that big weird monster.
It's
whatever
like
it
weird,
looks like.
Spiky turtle thing, whatever the heck Lavos is.
Yeah, it's like a Leviathan. It's like, I don't know where his eye is per se. It's like,
it's something.
It looks interesting.
It's something. But yeah,
it's something.
But yeah, so we'll be talking about Chrono Trigger a lot in the next couple of weeks. So prepare yourselves, friends, because that's going to be like the first like big game we do a deep dive on. Because I know a couple of people have asked us like, hey, if you're going to talk about a specific game, please tell us ahead of time because we want to, brief ourselves, prepare our bodies for that. Well, enough about that, Garrett. Let's read from the sacred texts. Our topic this week. What defines an RPG? This one has actually been proposed to us multiple times by people on Discord who have asked. I know Mr. Nasty Boost, for example, threw the question on the very first episode, asking us to do this, as well as a couple other people. But I mean, to be fair, this is one of the first episodes that Garrett and I talked about even doing. So this is something we had planned all along, much to the chagrin of people out there. So first of all, before we kind of get into what we personally think about that, and I'm going to go to you, Garrett, in just a second to kind of ask for your definition of RPG, I thought I would go to the Oxford Dictionary, because the Oxford Dictionary has role-playing game listed in the dictionary. So I thought I would read the literary definition of a role-playing game.
So the official definition that we should abide by.
Officially.
Is that correct?
Yeah, but this definition, again, is very loose, and you'll understand why after I read it. So an RPG, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is, quote, a game in which players take on the roles of imaginary characters who engage in adventures, typically in a particular computerized fantasy setting, overseen by a referee. So
that's a interesting last bit at the end there.
Yeah,
I didn't expect that one.
The referee would be like the dungeon master if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons or pen and paper RPG. But obviously, if you're playing a computerized role playing game, you don't really have a referee. I guess the referee in like a RPG video game would be like the systems, like the hard coded systems in the game, and that's kind of what keeps everything in check essentially.
Whether you win or lose like a certain task, it's up to the system itself, up to the game itself, really.
Yeah. So, and that just kind of differs from game to game. Of course, that's just the literary definition of an RPG, which again doesn't cover all RPGs or anything like that. But I think it's a good place to kind of start with kind of our base. So, Garrett, I'm going to start with you. To you, what defines an RPG?
Well, I wouldn't. That seems like a broad definition, the Oxford Dictionary one, because if I apply that definition to a lot of video games, I'm thinking a lot of action games could be RPGs. I'm thinking Zelda could be an RPG, which you can argue it is.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it isn't, but I can understand, like, for us, we know what kind of, we can focus a bit more of what an RPG is. And I think RPGs has a few type of categories or checklists that goes into my head. First is, I think what the Oxford Dictionary says, you are a character or a handful of characters in a fictional setting.
Yeah.
That's probably the first part that crosses my mind. It can't be a puzzle game. It can't be anything like that. It has to be, you're a character or some sort of avatar that you're controlling, and that is you're controlling it, and you're going through the story or whatever.
Quest is technically, in a lot of ways, a puzzle RPG. Just look on your face just says it all. I love this.
Yeah, I don't want to even go into that type of puzzle games are puzzle games to me. When you say puzzle RPG, I'm just like, no.
Puzzle Quest is a very silly game. So I just thought I'd throw that there because that was the first thing that leapt out to me as soon as you said puzzles can't be RPGs, Garrett. I mean, clearly there's one. It's on the PSP. You can go play it right now.
Yeah, of course. Another thing to me with an RPG, to go a little bit more in depth versus like maybe more of a Zelda game or an action game versus an RPG. I think it needs a little bit more of a stats system of some kind. It doesn't have to be a straightforward, here's a magic, defense, attack, or whatever, but some level of stats where you progress those stats throughout the game to make yourself stronger, and so on and so forth. So you need some type of leveling system with some stats. I think that's very essential to an RPG. And I think the last thing that I particularly would like to see in RPG, I don't know of any other games that doesn't have this. some sort of extra skill system of some kind, not just a regular attack and defense, but you have like other types of maneuvers that add strategy to the RPG, and you attain these in whatever means necessary in the RPG, whether it's leveling up, whether it's progressing through the story or whatnot. I think that's another essential part of it as well. And I think the last thing that every RPG needs to have is a story.
Yeah.
And it needs to have a very compelling story to make it a very good RPG. Whether it's a group of characters or a character by yourself, it needs to have some sort of story with that character to even make it a role-playing game. And I think that's probably cover most of my bases of what an RPG the definition of an RPG should be.
Yeah, and honestly, I agree with most of the points you made there too. Like, for example, the stats thing, definitely, I think that's definitely key to it qualifying as an RPG. That's one of the core RPG mechanics. When you look at a lot of games that when you try and group them into the RPG genre, that's one of the first things that comes to my mind is like, what kind of how is it stats driven in an RPG way? For example, again, is there a leveling system, and is your character kind of experiencing growth over the course of the gameplay, not just the player growth that you're experiencing by becoming more familiar with the game, but more so is the character that you're playing as growing in some particular way, whether it's through level-based stats like strength and magic, or in other ways. I think that there are other ways to do it besides just doing like hard-coded numbers. But, you know, hard-coded numbers are like the easiest way to tell if it's an RPG or it's going towards that. Because, again, that's a very definite callback to, again, pen and paper RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons, like Werewolf, like Vampire the Masquerade, where they are very...
Have you played Dungeons and Dragons?
I did. I used to play in high school. A lot.
Yeah.
And
nice.
D&D was very fun. I actually really loved it. But one of the things I didn't love about D&D was just a lot of dice rolling. It became a bit of a pain, but I love kind of using your own imagination to kind of, you know, think about these adventures and kind of you have a picture in your head that might be different from one of your other party members of you going on the same kind of quest together. So it's really interesting, and it gives you a lot of creative freedom, I think, versus like a video game RPG. Whereas obviously a video game RPG, you know, you're kind of locked in the box of the game's mechanics. So I definitely think I agree with you as far as stats and stuff like that. I also think of equipment management is definitely a big part of RPGs. Like having, you know, some kind of equipment progression throughout the course of the game, whether the equipment itself is as basic as like, you know, changing between weapons that have like very minor stats weights attributed to them versus something like Final Fantasy, where it's like the stats are heavily weighted on specific items or weapons, and you want to make sure you have kind of the latest or best gear kind of as you go along through the adventure. So I think equipment definitely plays a big part into making a game an RPG. And like you said, the story, I think you can have an RPG without a good story, but then it just, in a lot of ways, it starts to go into the camp of, you know, a not so good RPG, or like it kind of fails in the RPG department. But it definitely is all about story, because again, you're trying to like play the role of a character or a party that's going on this journey. So there has to be some kind of story that brings the player character into the experience and kind of allow you to take the role of that character. And it's something I also talk about a lot with licensed games, where kind of the best licensed games are the games that make you feel like you're playing that character from that license.
That's true.
And the best RPGs are the ones that make you feel like you're in that world. That make you feel like you're those party members and kind of going on the journey along with them. So I definitely think the story is definitely a big part of that. But as far as like the combat in a role-playing game, I think that just depends. And we're going to kind of get into kind of the subgenres and kind of define each one of those individually in a few minutes. But I definitely think combat can be varied for sure.
Yeah, I want to get with the equipment part again. I was trying to think of RPGs that you don't necessarily need that much equipment management, and that is, I think, tactical RPGs.
Right.
There are a few tactical RPGs where I think equipment's not really necessary, but it's more on the characters themselves and the classes themselves. So there is a little bit of, I think,
but even in games like that where the equipment management is mild, you still have equipment management. So
that's true.
It still checks the box off, and that's more what I'm getting at. Where like regardless of how mild it is, you know, there's some level of equipment management or even item management. You can throw that in there too, because even if you're not, you know, changing out guns, for example, you're usually, you know, buying potions or buying like med packs or, you know, whatever. Other items like special items to allow you to use different skills, for example, or to cure,
I totally agree with that. Yeah,
or cure status ailments, which I think is another big part. But again, I think you'd have an RPG without status ailments, for example. But to touch on one other thing that you talked about, Garrett, which was the player progression system. I think that's a big part of it too, like being able to making sure that you have like a set of skills outside of just your basic attacks. Like, for example, having magic attacks or having like steal skills or something like that. Also, resource management too, I think plays into a little of that too. Like having mana, for example, or skill points like SP kind of tacked on, I think, you know, makes it more of an RPG as well. Because again, if you have like a skill system, but you don't have a resource management thing attached to it, then it's no different than a normal attack in a lot of ways. Other than if it's like better against certain enemies or weaker against others, for example. So, I think that I'd throw that in there. But again, I think we've got kind of like the solid outline of what an RPG should look like. It should be like a game that's more that has a story, or at least is story based, that has you know, some level of player progression, as well as it's stat driven in some way, and it has like skills that are not just normal attacks, for example. I think that's kind of where we're going with that.
That's a good foundation to set on that we agreed on. Yep. Yeah, for sure.
For sure. So as far as subgenres, though, because again, the one big thing about RPGs is whenever we're describing a video game RPG, we're not. A lot of times when someone asks us to describe a game, we'll never usually say it's just an RPG. We'll usually put like some kind of connotation on it. Like it's a action RPG. It's a Japanese role-playing game. It's a turn-based RPG. It's a strategy RPG. And I figured it'd be fun to kind of break down each one of these and kind of give some examples of each, especially because I think doing this will actually help people who maybe aren't too familiar with RPGs kind of grasp, you know, how some of these work. So let's start with action RPGs, because this is the kind of the most common thing that we see today. Also, again, there's a lot of bleed over with modern games, especially between genres. And this one kind of is the one that kind of bleeds the most between, you know, the RPG genre and something else. So a typical example of an action RPG is something like Borderlands, for example, is an example of an action RPG where the combat itself is not turn-based in any way. Again, it's very much, you know, the second you press a button, something happens, essentially. It's not, it's very like, it's very immediate. Like the action is just very immediate from the way you interact with it. Another example would be something like Diablo. I think Diablo would be an action RPG where, again, both of those games, even though they play very different from each other, again, one's basically like a first-person shooter combined with an RPG, and the other one's like a top-down, like button-clicky, you know, action game that happens to have RPG elements. What is familiar about both those games and what ties them together are the things we talked about. You know, that you have player progression with stats across both games. Again, Borderlands, you see less of it, but it's still, there is some of that tied to your character. You've got equipment management. That's true. Because you're managing equipment in both those games, whether it's, you know, armor or weapons in something like Diablo, or even just your weapons or some of your other parts of your loadout in Borderlands. And then you've got story. Like both those games are, you know, heavy on the story, but at the same time, they're not like overly bearing with the story, I would say, in both of those examples. But again, like that's, even though they play very differently or look very different when you look at the two of them, foundationally, they're kind of in the same place.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think action RPGs are the most inviting type of RPG you can get with new players, with a lot of players, because now you see a lot of popular games incorporating RPG elements of some kind. And as you said, with Borderlands and Diablo. You got plenty of other like tentpole games like Assassin's Creed. You go through Ubisoft games and they're all type of like an action RPG now because they have a leveling system, they have some skill trees or skill sets, and so on and so forth. You can even argue a lot like sports games now. They have, I mean, they have RPG elements. They have stats. They have, you're managing players. You're going through the plays. So I think when people think of RPGs, they need to think about these RPG elements that are in the game, and that makes it really enticing, especially for these action RPGs. It's like, hey, you are an RPG player. If you play like an Assassin's Creed game for like 80 hours, you're the grind or the hook of that game is not only the action part, but also the progression part, the skills and the characters, and so on and so forth. So I think action RPGs is probably the most inviting one for everyone to be involved.
It's the most similar to the genre to like other genres that people are more familiar with, like shooters, or just third-person action games, like a Naughty Dog style game or something like that. So it's definitely the most inviting out of all of those ones, I would say. And then kind of the next one on that scale would be a term that, again, I find myself using much less nowadays, but was definitely something you'd hear a lot in the 90s and 2000s when describing RPGs, are Japanese role-playing games, where, again, in theory, a Japanese role-playing game can mean anything nowadays, where
it's kind of crazy, actually.
It had like when you had like what's referred to as a Japanese role-playing game in the 80s or 90s, it usually meant one specific thing. It was a game developed in Japan. It was turn-based. It was very story-based. It was very mechanic, like very much equipment and stats-based. Like that was kind of how those games felt. And then, but I think we started to move away from calling things Japanese role-playing games because now we get so many different types of role-playing games from Japan that it's hard to put them kind of in that box. And the term I now like to use instead to kind of describe more of the traditional Japanese role-playing game is a turn-based RPG instead. It's kind of what the term I like to use now, where again, it's kind of that same feel where you have, it's everyone takes turns, and sometimes, for example, those turns are immediate, where you'll put down like what kind of attack you want to use right away, and then it just happens right there. Sometimes you'll queue up a whole bunch of actions from all your party members, and then they'll all kind of play out in the battle. And they can kind of vary between game to game, essentially, how all that works. But then they're very story focused, usually. 9 times out of 10, they'll be more focused on the story because you don't really have the element of the action kind of pulling you into the gameplay experience. And usually they'll have turn-based RPGs. We don't get too many of them that use like non-2D style. Like for the most part, we don't get really too many 3D turn-based RPGs. We did in kind of the PS1 era, but most of the ones we get nowadays, unless your name is Persona, you're usually like an indie game. So something like Cosmic Star Heroine or Undertale, like something that is very much a 2D old school looking game, or kind of calling back to that old school aesthetic essentially. But I wouldn't limit it by that anyways. But that's how I feel about turn-based RPGs. What do you think about turn-based RPGs? Am I kind of on the right base with this, Garrett?
I think you're on a good path there. I just want to go back to just Japanese RPGs. I can understand now that you think of more like you want to kind of put them all together, kind of a turn-based RPG, but I still argue that you have Japanese action RPGs, which and that the strict definition probably for that is it's an action RPG that's from a Japanese developer. But we have to be very careful because Dragon's Dogma, you could say it's a Japanese action RPG, but it's definitely a Western trope kind of RPG similar to Skyrim or anything like that.
Or that's maybe where I would lump like something like Zelda in. Where Zelda's more like
that's
that.
True.
Where it's like a Japanese action RPG, like more, but it's also playing a lot of elements from like Western games in particular.
I mean, you can argue Final Fantasy 15 and the future Final Fantasy games. Those are going to be the Japanese action RPG. That's going to be the probably the most symbolic type of games for that genre. But yeah, I want to make sure I got Japanese RPGs in my head. It's more of it's a Japanese trope. And what I mean by that is you can feel an essence of influence of Japanese culture in there, and some sort of like, I don't know, anime aesthetic could be, or any other kind of culturally influence that's based off of that region of Japan. I consider more of a Japanese RPG than anything else. And it can have systems of turn-based or action or whatever, like that. So yeah, I kind of think of Japanese RPGs more along the lines of that. And then turn-based RPGs, you can put them in that category a little bit, but I think more turn-based RPGs now is that there's a lot coming from the West as well. Yeah. And as you said, you know, all those games and even indie games, I think of Child of Light as one of my like biggest turn-based RPGs that come from around here. So yeah, I like to keep some of that difference, and I understand from a time period standpoint, we can say that a lot of traditional Japanese RPGs, the game that pops in my head is Dragon Quest, and Dragon Quest is still pushing that type of traditional turn-based, stats-based, and you got a story
to the point where like you can play the game in like NES style, the exact same game.
It's crazy.
You switch between them. So it's just, I mean, they haven't really changed much. And again, my point of view on the subject more changes to like before we would say like Japanese role-playing game would be like a specific genre because it had a very specific feel and gameplay style to it, where now I think the term Japanese role-playing game has evolved to the point where it's more like a subtype where like you attach it to another genre. So it's like kind of like how you talked about, where it's like a Japanese action role RPG or a Japanese turn-based RPG. But I wouldn't refer to it as like a specific genre anymore in the same way that I probably would have maybe, 10 or 20 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's more where I'm coming from with that one. But yeah, so examples of turn-based RPGs, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, Persona, anything like that kind of fits that category. Pokemon, for sure. Next category, though, is strategy RPGs. So strategy RPGs are kind of born from the strategy genre because, again, we've got turn-based strategy games, we've got real-time strategy games. But what's different between a turn-based strategy game and a turn-based and a strategy RPG is a strategy RPG, again, takes the turn-based strategy game formula where it's very much a you're taking more of a strategic look at the game, very much usually from an overhead perspective. But sometimes in the case of something like Valkyria Chronicles, where you're doing like a third-person perspective, but you still get the overlook of the battlefield, it almost feels like you're commanding troops. But you bring in the stats elements, you bring in the level progression, you bring in the story elements, you bring in all of the other stuff that we talked about that makes an RPG, and then combine it with the strategy element that you see in a turn-based strategy game like Civilization, for example. You're kind of
Civ is probably the most represented example of a turn-based strategy game. Yeah. Not a role-playing game.
Yeah. Besides that, you also got games like Galactic Civilizations or Master of Orion and stuff like that. Like those are kind of examples of turn-based strategy games, but they're not RPGs because, again, you've got like resource management in the sense that you're kind of, allocating money or you're building bases and stuff like that. But they're not really stats-driven in the same way that RPGs are. Or they're not pulling RPG elements into Civilization, for example. And again, examples of this would be like Fire Emblem, Shining Force, Disgaea. I think those are like the three kind of more prominent strategy RPG series that I can think of. But for the most part, they're very niche nowadays.
Yes.
We don't see them too often. Project Triangle Strategy is another one too. I just thought of it as we were talking about this.
Mario plus Rabbids.
Mario plus Rabbids, technically a strategy RPG. Yep. Especially because that game in particular, like XCOM kind of skirts the line, but I would say it's definitely closer to that than a turn-based strategy game. Like it's closer to the strategy RPG thing. But that's kind of like that's where I would put like kind of the boundary of something like XCOM, because it's not as well, I guess the newer XCOM games are more RPGs, but I'm thinking in my head more like the older XCOM games, like XCOM Terror from the Deep or UFO Defense, because the older XCOM games very much are not RPGs at all. They don't really have RPG mechanics. You have the different equipment management that you'd have in an RPG, but it's closer to something like Civilization, but with combat essentially. Versus
same thing with Gears Tactics, right? Like it does have characters and you're progressing them, but you're not really progressing stats in any way, right?
Or you don't really have like levels for the characters or anything like that.
That's true.
Versus, again, the newer XCOM games, you're definitely right. Like XCOM 2 or like XCOM Enemy Unknown, for example, like those are definitely more tactical RPGs, essentially. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that one seems pretty easy, pretty cut and dry anyways. Again, the second you start to introduce all of those other RPG elements that we kind of talked about, that's what changes it from like a strategy, like a turn-based strategy game to like a strategy role-playing game, essentially.
Yep.
But we don't see those too often because, again, they're very niche unless you had a PlayStation Vita, because we had lots of them on Vita. We had like Natural Doctrine and some other weird ones there. But
Square Enix, come on, we need Final Fantasy Tactics of some kind, please. In a presentation. I know it'd be too good to be true, but I don't think a lot of people really or publishers see them having a wide audience or a big audience, and that's why they don't really lean into it these days. But they definitely have an audience. Fire Emblem, I know the series is not as successful or near successful as other RPGs, but it's still pretty good for what it's on. It found an audience, and I think they're really trying to make it accessible to everyone. I see that in Fire Emblem Three Houses. I see that in Disgaea 6 as well. They are really pushing, like, hey, it's not going to be as hard, tricky, and complicated. Here, you can make it as easy as you want. You can even just make it auto battle a little bit to make sure you kind of understand what the patterns are or going through the game. So yeah.
Well, a game like Disgaea too, the crazy thing about that is like when you look at the publisher NIS who publishes Disgaea, like that's like their big franchise is a strategy RPG, which we never see from like anyone. Because again, even with a game like Fire Emblem, I think it's probably the most popular current strategy role-playing series, but it's not like Nintendo's cash cow or anything like that, or the thing that makes them the bucks. Right. Disgaea is very much like the make or break franchise in a lot of ways for NIS, where it's like NIS makes a lot of really interesting RPGs, but like their main one, like the main series that's like kind of tied to their name, to the point where like their mascot is a Disgaea character, like it's crazy to think about.
Or whatever, yeah. It's kind of crazy to see Disgaea still being out there, and they're really pushing it to put it in all current gen consoles. It's like you have all the Disgaea games, I think, on Switch now. Yep. Or at least most of them.
Well, I think Disgaea 3 and 2 are the ones that are missing.
Right. Yeah. That's correct.
Yeah. But also most of them are on PC. Most of them are on PlayStation 4 as well. And again, the same two are missing 3 and 2. For some reason, they haven't ever done like a remake of those. Or I shouldn't say that, because they actually did a remake of 2 on PSP. And that's available on Vita if you want to go get it from the Vita store.
And Disgaea 3 is on Vita as well.
Oh, that's true. I forgot about that. So yeah, I guess most of them, if you got a PlayStation Vita and a PlayStation 4, you've got pretty much all the Disgaea games there. So there you go.
Yep.
But then the last kind of RPG genre, unless I'm missing any, Garrett, and you can correct me in a second, MMOs are a genre that we should talk about as well. And again, we're not going to probably dive too deep into MMOs here, because again, we've got a whole MMO episode that is going to come at you guys later in down the road. We're going to kick that one down the road a little bit. But what defines an MMO is essentially taking the RPG formula, making it basically multiplayer only, and then expanding it to however many players you want to have in a world. Again, what basically defines an MMO versus like a multiplayer RPG is essentially having like more than 50 players at a time in your RPG world, essentially, and just having like one giant world that is usually on like a server blade that usually supports somewhere in the range of like 250,000 to 500,000 players. Essentially.
Yeah, like a ton of players.
Yeah. Not only that, but usually like anytime you'll go into, anytime you want to explore a dungeon or do like a raid or an instance, you're not playing by yourself. You're usually playing with anywhere between 4 party members and 52. So depending on what you're doing. That's kind of what defines an MMO versus a more traditional RPG. Also, most MMOs too can either be action based. So games like Terra, for example, are pretty much just action RPGs that happen to be MMOs because of the player count. Essentially, is kind of what makes it an MMO. Versus a game like Final Fantasy 14 or a game like World of Warcraft, which is more cooldown based, so it's much closer to a turn-based RPG in that sense, where essentially you're essentially taking your turn, and usually the turns are very quick because usually your everything has like a global cooldown of like 3 or 4 seconds. So you can usually initiate a command every 3 or 4 seconds, which again makes it feel more like a turn-based RPG that just happens to be played out in real time, if that makes any sense.
Yes. I think Elder Scrolls Online and New World, like it is cooldown based, but I would argue they're really trying to modernize it and make it more action based by adding a little bit more dodging and weaving. Because in like World of Warcraft or anything like that, you really can't dodge unless you add a buff to yourself or anything like that, right? Yeah. Is that my understanding?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's less about dodging attacks than something like Final Fantasy XIV, where most of the mechanics of those bosses are like all kinds of things you got to dodge. Like it'll show you on the ground, here's the place where the attack's going to happen. Don't stand here, you're going to die, kind of thing.
Right. Right. So yeah, ESL has a blocking mechanic, and it has like a push mechanic as well to like daze and confuse the enemy. So it's more action oriented, and New World is definitely very much like that as well. There is some skills, there is some cooldown, but also you're very fast, and it's like Phantasy Star is kind of like that too. You can actually dodge attacks that are coming right at you versus here's where the attack's going to be in this area, and you better move away from this area. So I think MMOs are skimming to that point of more action based, and it's actually really cool to see. It's more interactivity, I think.
Yeah, and that's why I think they're much more approachable now than they were 15 years ago when like EverQuest was out.
Yeah.
Or again, like World of Warcraft had just come out in 2004. So like, yeah, I think MMOs have come a long way, and they're very much, we're kind of like in the infancy of that genre in particular, because it honestly hasn't been around for very long, like since 2000 essentially. So especially when you compare it to other genres of RPGs, because again, we've had action RPGs or turn-based RPGs or strategy RPGs since like the 80s. So they've had much more time to evolve, and we're kind of seeing like a lot of the final forms for some of those. Whereas MMOs, we haven't really seen kind of the final form of the MMO yet, and kind of what MMOs can do going forward. So, yeah.
The biggest thing with MMORPGs, as you know, with Ryan, you can sink in a crazy amount of hours, and there is no end to this genre. That's probably the biggest thing behind it, is that you have so many different things to do, including multiplayer, but also more single player than ever before as well. And you could just keep grinding and just keep doing what you're doing. And if you like that game, that could be your one game that you could play for just for a while.
It lasts forever. I mean, and even something like, even though Destiny, for example, I wouldn't consider an MMO basically based on just the play count. It has a lot of similar things to MMOs. Like it basically, we're seeing a lot more service-based games take elements from MMOs, that grindiness, the stuff you just talked about, Garrett, and then bring it into like a traditional action game or a traditional first-person shooter even, and kind of making it this like action RPG that's like a hybrid between that and MMO mechanics, for example, and kind of making them, because a game like Destiny, for example, has raids in it, and the raids in that game are very similar to MMO raids. They're just on a much smaller scale, because you've only got 6 players versus 8 to 16 to 50. So again, we're seeing a lot of bleed and more crossover. So again, in 20 years' time, I think we're going to really see kind of where MMOs are going to shake out and kind of be like its own genre and have like much more defined than kind of the definition we're giving today. But again, we'll talk about more of that when we talk about the MMO episode that we're going to talk about. So Garrett, the one question I wanted to ask you that, again, you already kind of know about because you put it on the show notes. When is a game not an RPG? Like when is a game that maybe has like RPG elements but doesn't qualify as an RPG? Like when does it get removed from that?
So when we go through these like various checklists in our head in the beginning of this podcast, I kind of run through that checklist and see if that makes it more of an RPG. And if one of the key points and area is missing from that, then I would say, okay, that game is an action-based game that has RPG elements in there. I think like one of the biggest things I could think of, like action-based that does have RPG elements. Again, I think Ubisoft, you can argue it being a role-playing game, but I can also see it just being an action-based game that has RPG elements in there. A lot of RPG systems and everything like that. But like, to be honest with you, when I think of Assassin's Creed, it's not bred from an RPG genre at all. It's like throughout its iterations, it's been adding more and more RPG elements in there. And then at the end, this is what we get. We get this type of Assassin's Creed kind of game with a lot of these systems that are together. So I think, like, you know, when a game's not an RPG, I really run through my head of those systems. And I think of Zelda, again, you can argue it being an RPG, but like there's like most of the Zelda games that I think of are the original Zelda games. I mean, I argue they're not RPGs at all, and that's fine. They're action-based puzzle games. You get specific items and everything, but you don't have a leveling system. You don't have stats. You are playing a character. So yeah, it's a back and forth. But if it's missing some of those items that are in our checklist, then I don't consider them as role-playing games.
Yeah, and to your point, out of all the Zelda games, I think the one that's closest to an RPG is actually Zelda 2 on NES, because you have a progression system with Link. You have to get a bunch of different abilities. You have a bunch of attacks, for example, that aren't just your standard attack. Like you've got the lightning attack. You've got the shield magic. You've got a bunch of different, like, you're not collecting items in that game. You're progressing Link throughout the game, and it feels more like an action RPG experience, more similar to something like Kingdom Hearts versus something like... versus the other Zelda games, where again you're progressing Link in the sense that you're getting the items that allow you into new areas. But those games, like A Link to the Past, for example, is actually probably got more similar to a game like Metroid than it does to like an action or like an Kingdom Hearts. That's the example I kind of gave there, like an action RPG. So yeah, I would definitely say that the second you kind of remove one of those elements, I definitely think you probably pull it out of those categories. I'm the type of person, though, that actually considers specifically Odyssey and Valhalla on the Assassin's Creed camp are action RPGs, because those games not only are very much developed as RPGs in mind, but they feel very much like BioWare games in that way, where they have they meet all of the criteria I have for that checklist. Whereas a game like Assassin's Creed Syndicate, for example, which started to bring in, it was really the first game to bring in the RPG elements. You didn't really have like the same progression system that you'd have in an RPG. So that's why I would think that not only that, but you had some attacks, for example, that were different from your standard attack, but it wasn't in the same way that Assassin's Creed Valhalla, for example, which feels very much like a Mass Effect or a Dragon Age in that way, where you've got abilities on cooldown, you've got equipment like you have a bunch of equipment management like you would in RPGs. You have all of the attacks are numbered based. They're all stats based. You see the numbers fly off the enemies as you're attacking them. And those games go on forever, just like almost like MMOs do, or just like, especially Odyssey, which would actually generate side quests for you through this, like, you know, this procedurally generated element. Once you finish all the quests in that game, it will generate side quests for you, so you can play that game infinitely if you want to grind out your character.
We could talk about Assassin's Creed forever, because I'm a huge fan, and I agree with you. These last three games, Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla, probably RPGs than any other game genre.
Origins kind of skirts the line a little bit, kind of in the same way that one of the other game I talked about kind of did. But then definitely Odyssey and Valhalla definitely are very much like they've developed those as action RPGs, like The Witcher, for example.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, totally Witcher vibes in there. It's weird because I love the beginning, like the start of Assassin's Creed games from 2 all the way to Syndicate. I played all the way to Syndicate. Origins I played through, I did not like as much. I'm trying to play Valhalla and Odyssey. I don't like it as much. I don't care much about these RPG elements, and I think it's just fatigue a little bit with the Ubisoft. And Ubisoft loves to do this with all their games. That's fantasy type style games. It's like, all right, let's put the Ubisoft template onto this game, and let the players go through all of this content that we've kind of just copied, and I wouldn't say copy and pasted, but there's a template and they build off of it.
Or just a lot of it feels like fluff. when you go through it. Like some of the side, especially like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, I think had really good side missions, but it was like not the norm for what I consider for Ubisoft games, because even we saw some of that bleed over into something like Far Cry 5, for example, which it was starting to introduce some RPG elements into it. But again, a lot of the side missions at that game, I just like, why am I even doing this? Like, what do I get out of this? Like, cool, I get to go like upgrade my wallet, I guess, but it's like, you know, it didn't really feel the same. So yeah, I hear you. But yeah, most actually with what you talked about, what makes a game not an RPG, I kind of agree with too. Like all the points you made, where it's essentially just, if it takes one of the things off the checklist, it's not an RPG anymore. It's got to kind of it's got to fit that basic criteria that we talked about, kind of as the foundation of what makes an RPG essentially.
I have one particular franchise I wanted to ask you about, because I actually skirt the line whether it's RPG or not. And I think it's more of not now that we're discussing through this. Have you played the Dishonored games?
I have, yeah.
Okay. Do you consider that as an action stealth-based RPG?
I think it's another game that kind of skirts the line, but more so, I think it's on the line. It's outside the line of being an RPG. It's close to being an RPG. I think it has a lot. I think those games have a lot of RPG elements to them, but I think it's missing kind of the stats-based thing that we talked about from the foundation. I think that's kind of the key difference between that. So I definitely don't think that those games are RPGs. They're close though. They're close to being
very
RPGs.
Close.
But
and I think that's what makes them likable too. Like if they didn't have those RPG elements, I don't know if I would ever play Dishonored, because the stealth based are like, for me, they're so tense. They're so like, I don't know, behind the scenes or whatever.
Like I would say out of Arcane's games, I would say the closest that actually fits an RPG is Prey. The Prey reboot
that's true.
From a couple years ago, like the reboot of Prey, because that had a lot of really deep, you know, RPG like stats-based elements in that game. Like it really felt more like an action RPG. Like I would consider that an RPG versus Dishonored, because it goes more in that RPG direction than a game like that.
Do you think a lot of these games that we think of fantasy type style, or like anything that's not sports related or puzzle related or whatever, do you think everyone's just trying to put that RPG elements in there to create the fluff or create the content, or trying to satisfy some sort of grind in their games, versus if they didn't have RPG elements in there? What do you think of that? A lot of these types of games adding RPG elements, does it really benefit them?
I feel like there must have been some kind of market research done or focus group testing that was done that basically told companies that putting RPG elements in their games make the player feel more invested in the experience. I think that's like, for example, if your fantasy soccer team in FIFA has RPG elements according to that, like you progress and stuff like that. It's like that extra carrot on the end of the stick that essentially tries to like get you to keep playing the game and try and stick with the game longer. I think that's kind of where that comes from. I don't think it's necessary to add fluff, but I think it's to add replayability or add, you know, playtime to games that might not have had that before. For example, a game like FIFA, for example, if it didn't have RPG elements, if you didn't have the whole FIFA Ultimate Team set game type, like how much can you say you would actually continue to play that game every single week? Like it might get stale. Versus if you're progressing, like even if you lose a match, you feel like you're progressing in some way. So I feel like that. I think that's where it comes from more than anything.
I see. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Before we get into questions and everything, I just want to mention one subgenre that we didn't really touch upon, and that is, well, Western RPGs is like a type, so it's like Japanese RPGs.
It's more like a subtype.
Going more focus, CRPGs.
Oh, that's true.
Computerized RPGs. It's a very niche type of RPG. It stems from probably like older type of RPGs that we see in Western role-playing games, like the original Fallout, and then you can get into like Pillars of Eternity. But yeah, it's the games that you're kind of, my understanding, it can be turn-based or action-based. But it's isometric. You have a handful of a party together, and it's kind of more or less dungeon crawling or going through a story of some kind with your characters. I think the biggest game that's out there that's a CRPG is Divinity Original Sin 2. And those types of role-playing games where you're kind of panned out and then you control your characters all around, but it can be turn-based or action-based RPGs. So do you have any history with CRPGs or anything like that?
I have. In fact, I've talked about it a few times. I can't really get into CRPGs at all. I've tried many times, whether it's Baldur's Gate 2 or Icewind Dale or, again, Pillars of Eternity or Divinity Original Sin. Like, I've played all those games and just can't get into that genre for whatever. It's almost like too rigid for me. But more than anything, I think actually what those games call back to more to is not so much old school RPGs from like the 80s on your PC, but more so traditional Dungeons and Dragons or like paper RPGs, where they very much feel like paper RPGs, but on your computer screen, essentially. And in a lot of ways, that's where a game like Baldur's Gate came from, because Baldur's Gate, developed by BioWare, was very much a Dungeons and Dragons licensed game, and they wanted to translate the exact kind of Dungeons and Dragons experience to a computerized role-playing game. So essentially, that's where a lot of that genre really comes from, is games like that. But then again, you've got much older games, again, because that genre has been around forever, like since like the early, like the late 80s. Like anything from like Planescape Torment or just so many different like big box PC games. I'm trying to picture them all in my head right now. Right. Going back.
And I think it's much more actually open now to a much wider audience because they're putting it on console.
Yeah.
And they're trying to make it more modern than any before. I think what's the most recent one? It's like Dark Alliance, right?
Well, you've got the new Dark Alliance is a it's an action RPG. It's a third person.
That one's an action RPG. Yeah, yes.
But I would actually say the most recent one would be Disco Elysium. Would probably be the
Disco
most
Elysium is
example.
Yes. Yeah.
Because that just came to consoles recently too. So there you go. But Garrett, let's get into some of these questions, because it's 50 minutes into the show. We had a pretty lengthy discussion. I think we covered all our bases on this one. No, don't be sorry. I think it was a good conversation anyways.
Great stuff.
So obviously we had a question from last week that we mentioned we were going to discuss this week. So let's start with that one. And this one, it's going to take a few minutes for us to get through too. This one comes to us from Blaze Knight at Blaze Knight 0923. And he asks, you are tasked with directing an RPG with a Starfox cross FZero setting / character roster. What type of RPG is it, and how do you write these two series together? So obviously we've been talking about RPG subgenres. We've defined them, Garrett. So now we're gonna take on the example of developing our own RPG. So what type of RPG would you make this FZero Starfox game, Garrett?
This is a very good question, because you're mashing two franchises that, you know, they could collaborate and could come together, because they're kind of spacey, kind of futuristic genres. For me, the type of RPG I think of in my head instantly, and this is what I just want for Starfox in general, let alone FZero, is a kind of a story-based BioWare type of RPG. I don't want it like squad-based or anything like that, but like have characters, have a narrative driven towards it. And the basis of the game is two things. One is that you're on, there's multiple different planets. You're going to have to do some type of racing with FZero. And so you have a car base, and then you can develop that car however you want. And then try to like be the best in every planet. But at the same time, there's some sort of Star Wars kind of galactic kind of struggle or conflict between planet to planet. There's some type of like friction between, I don't know, the Starfox legions and like, let's say Wolf and all of them who are kind of like rogues. Maybe Andros is in there, but I would love some sort of flight, combat type of style of combat with RPGs, like build up my starship as well. So I'll have a race car and a starship to kind of like build up together. Maybe there could be like some sort of symbiotic, like if they have the same type of gear or same type of weapons or whatever, you get like bonus stats between the both of them. I don't want a character driven shooty based RPG with this. It's all about the vehicles. It's all about the car. It's all about the starship. And then like characters will have interactivity and relations and everything like that. So that's the type of game I'm thinking of in my head when I think of Starfox cross FZero.
The hilarious thing, Garrett, is literally I have like a completely different game pitch in my head.
Good.
Whereas I think
it's really good.
Where I think that the game that I was kind of picturing with this question is more of a more of a turn-based RPG, because when you think about these two franchises, they couldn't be more different from each other. The only similarities between the two of them are they take place in the future, and then they both involve vehicles. That's it.
Yes.
That's the two similarities between those two games. So obviously there's alien races, for example, in F-Zero, so it would actually make sense for the Starfox universe to be part of the F-Zero universe, because like Starfox, Fox McCloud or Falco, they're aliens. They're anthropomorphic aliens, but they're still aliens in versus humans, obviously, if you put them in the same world together. So that's maybe how I would see them kind of crossing over. And then kind of for my 4 party members, I would select Fox and Falco from Star Fox, and then obviously Captain Falcon, but also I would say Dr. Stewart from the original F-Zero, who pilots the Golden Fox. And then as you play through the combat again, because you could have like kind of on foot, like it'll start with the characters on foot. And then, because obviously the F-Zero characters can still fight usually using their fists. For example, Captain Falcon, we see him in Smash, does the Falcon Punch. Falcon Punch could even be a skill you use, for example. It writes itself, right? And then obviously with the Star Fox characters, they could be more of your ranged characters. They've got a lot of guns, for example, like Fox and Falco have like blasters and stuff like that. So that's kind of how you have your party makeup, where you have the F-Zero characters are more like your melee characters, and then the Star Fox characters are more like your support kind of ranged characters, essentially, in your turn-based party. And then you'll build up a meter in combat that will allow you to summon your vehicles. Whether it's the F-Zero characters, you've got your cars, or the Star Fox characters with the R-Wings. And then each of those vehicles will have different abilities, like skills that you can use along with that when you basically have them out. And it's like a temporary thing, essentially. And as far as how I would incorporate that into the open world, I think you can summon your car or your R-Wing anywhere you want in your world in order to travel the world and stuff. And then maybe there are certain areas where you have to use the car, and certain areas where you have to use the R-Wing. But maybe that's kind of where my mindset is. But again, I've always just got turn-based RPGs on the brain, Garrett. So that explains kind of where I'm coming up with this one. But I think that way you kind of even the playing field between the different characters, because obviously if you could just play as the characters with the R-Wings all the time, why wouldn't you just do that? Like, why play as the F-Zero characters? Whereas I think having like it be turn-based really balances out the difference between the characters in a way that makes sense to have in one game.
That's a good point. Do you think in this turn-based game, is it going to be all on foot, all on a planet? Or do you imagine have some vehicle focused in some...
I suspect it would be like my plan would be like something like Cosmic Star Heroine, where essentially you're not really doing much space exploration, but you're going you can go from planet to planet once you progress to a certain part in the story. Just like, again, like so many classic like SNES RPGs where you're on foot for a portion of the experience. Maybe, they're marooned on the planet, for example, and they can't leave, for example. Like, you can build some story reason into why they can't, go into space. And then as you progress, you'll get more and more modes of transportation, the ability to go between different planets. That's kind of where my mindset is on this game. Either way, it would be a very wacky game, because both those franchises are kind of weird, and then kind of mashing them together it'd be a bit of an odd one. But
yeah, that's true.
That would be one to play. So there you go. Blaze, I hope that answers your question, because we had like two very different ideas.
Completely different. I love it though. I would totally play both games.
Yeah, so. I think you could do some fun things with those settings. And in fact, I think when thinking about this question between last week and this week, I felt like this makes more sense than like a Metroid F-Zero crossover, because we had that fake rumor years ago of like them of the F-Zero and Metroid crossover, and everyone was like celebrating. They were like, "Oh, this would be so awesome!" And I'm like, I was the one person I think who was like, I don't know if that's such a great idea, because again, it's like
it's kind of weird.
They play so differently from each other, and it just. Again, it feels like F-Zero and Star Fox make more sense together, because, again, they're both vehicle-based. They're mostly about vehicles and less about the on-foot stuff. So I think it makes more sense to mash these together than something like Metroid. All right. Next question comes to us from Adam AJ Sandoval at Anime Gaming Lift on Twitter, and he asks, if you were to revive one RPG franchise, which would it be? Personally, I would revive Legend of Legaia. Which was actually a PlayStation 1 game, for those that haven't played it. Okay. So, Garrett, to give you some time to think about your answer to this question, The one that I would normally just say Parasite Eve, because I say Parasite Eve on every show, I feel like. So I'm going to be less boring and say something different. Honestly, the one RPG franchise I would love to see come back from Sony first party is Legend of Dragoon. From the PlayStation 1. I think we had heard rumors around Bluepoint doing like a Legend of Dragoon remake for so long. Obviously, that hasn't panned out yet because we haven't gotten another one. Fun fact about Legend of Dragoon, they did have a PlayStation 2 sequel in the works for the longest time, and it ended up actually being canceled, unfortunately. Not only that, but I don't know which studio would do that now because Sony Japan was the developers behind that game. In fact, fun fact, Shuhei Yoshida was like one of the producers on that game before he kind of moved into like one of the higher roles over at Sony. So it's just funny looking back on that game and seeing how many of the top people at some of the Japanese side of Sony were like worked on that game essentially. But yeah, it's this big, epic JRPG that is turn-based, but it had this action element to it, almost like Super Mario RPG, where like when you initiate an attack, you'd have to press the button at a specific time in order to either not miss or actually to do more damage. And it was combo-based too, so as you would progress through the game, you would learn different attacks that would have like more and more like things you had to chain together. So sometimes you'd have to time like 10 hits that would happen at specific intervals while you were doing your attack. So it's kind of this like nice risk reward kind of thing where you can you can do one of this more simple combos that deal less damage, or you can do like one of the more complex ones. But if you screw up the combo, then you don't do as much damage or you'll just miss completely. So yeah, I thought that was always like a really interesting RPG game that just never got a sequel or never got remade. It's stuck on the PS1. It's beloved. People love that game. But for whatever reason, just Sony never did anything with it. So that's the one that I would say I wish would come back the most. Obviously, though, Parasite Eve is kind of the other one, but I've talked about that to death on other episodes. Garrett, what about you?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this for quite a while. There's a lot of RPGs that I don't think of in my head that are just gone forever or stuck in a certain platform. Just for me personally, the games I played. But the one franchise that I would love to see to come back and have just a fresh take on it is actually Advance Wars.
Okay.
I've played probably like a handful of hours of the older games, and I really like the strategy RPG behind it. It's very unique compared to any other strategy RPG I've played. And people are trying to mimic it right now. It's just nowhere near close. I just think Advance Wars more of like it's a weird thing to say, but Red Alert.
Yeah.
Like it is a military type of game where there's bases all around and you're trying to like control all the bases that you can. Wargroove is very similar to like this as well.
Yeah.
But I would love to see like a fresh take on it, just to see what can you do differently with this franchise and put it on all the systems, put it on phone. Like these type of games, you can put it on pretty much anything you want. But yeah, like I love these type of games. I can play with these hours on end, and I would just love like a good take on Advance Wars. So what do you think of that?
I mean, it's been so long since we got an Advance Wars game. Like the last one was that GameCube third-person shooter that I'm blanking on the name on, that tried to take like Advance Wars but turn it into like a third-person shooter, and it was real bad. So yeah, Advance Wars was really fun. That's another game too, going back to like our RPG genre talk, that kind of skirts the line of being more of a turn-based RPG, more of a turn-based strategy game, but has enough RPG elements where I would qualify it as an RPG. So it's like right kind of on that line where it's more closer to, again, something like a turn-based Command and Conquer that is also an RPG essentially, and less goofy than that game. But yeah, I really like those games. I'm actually, again, that's another series that I'm surprised Nintendo never brought back, especially with seeing how Fire Emblem's really performed, where I think people are really into that type of genre, and I would love to see kind of Nintendo kind of revisit that. And again, like you said, we've been getting lots of games like Wargroove that's kind of, trying to bring back that spirit. But yeah, like no one's really perfected that same formula that Intelligent Systems had with that game, because I think it was Intelligent Systems that did Advance Wars, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
But I think part of the reason why they can't go back to it is because they're so good at Fire Emblem that they'll never be allowed to go back to it, right? Like, because Intelligent Systems is basically like on Fire Emblem duty or support studio duty, because they also do they support a bunch of other games too that Nintendo does. But I think they're basically permanently stuck on Fire Emblem until Nintendo tells them they can stop. So
until further notice.
Yeah, and yeah, whether or not Nintendo would want to invest in another studio to do Advance Wars, I think is kind of the biggest hurdle for that game.
That was my one of my bingo prediction cards for Nintendo E3 is let's have a Advance Wars game developed by the War Group devs or with Chucklefish Studios, just because I think that's a game that it's easily transferable to an indie franchise like what they did with what's that, Crypt of the Necrodancer.
Cadence of Hyrule.
Cadence of Hyrule, yeah. I think that's another easy franchise that you can lend off to an indie studio and see what they could do with it.
I'm actually kind of surprised after Cadence of Hyrule, we didn't really see more of that. We haven't really seen Nintendo really pair with a lot of indie studios with their IPs. I thought when they did Cadence of Hyrule and it was really successful, I thought we were going to see more of that. So I'm actually kind of surprised we haven't yet. But yeah, we'll see, I guess.
We'll see.
Last question comes to us from Ryan Craig at Mathman1024. He asks, what are some RPGs that you'd like to have a New Game Plus mode for? I would love to run through old Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy games as an overpowered warrior once I've already beaten them. Also, can we start pronouncing RPGs as RPEGs, similar to how we say JPEGs for JPEG files? Ryan Craig, I don't think we're. Please don't make me ever say RPEGs as a genre type. It's too much. It's too much.
It's too much. I can't handle this blasphemy. No, I can't do it.
As far as New Game Plus, I'm rarely the type of player that likes to play New Game Plus in games, mainly because once I finish a game, a lot of times I'm on to the next game and kind of, not continuing to go back to a game. So the only reason why I would want to have New Game Plus is to have a story reason for doing New Game Plus. A game like Trials of Mana, for example, I think did New Game Plus really well, because once you finish the game, you actually had this additional story section that happens after you do New Game Plus, essentially, with that game. So I thought that was really interesting. It gave you a reason to go back and do it. So whereas a lot of times, for example, when Marvel's Spider-Man gave you New Game Plus, it was I can go back into the city, I guess, with my powers again and play the story over again, but there's no other reason why I'm doing this, so why am I doing New Game Plus, right? So that's kind of how I feel about New Game Plus. So for games I would want to see this would just be games I would want to see additional content added to. So a game like Final Fantasy VI, for example, I think would be awesome to have New Game Plus, because then you could add more to that story or something like that. That's one that I would love to see. To your point, Ryan, either older Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest games, I wish they had New Game Plus with new story reasons, or maybe if you did New Game Plus, you got a different ending or something like that. Kind of in the same way that a game like Chrono Trigger does it, for example, because that's how you get all the other endings in Chrono Trigger, is by doing New Game Plus, essentially. So I wish that more SNES or old school RPGs did that back in the day, because that was such a neat thing with Chrono Trigger. So that's kind of how I feel about New Game Plus. What about you, Garrett? What do you think about this question?
I'm on the same boat. There's a lot of games that I just don't play New Game Plus just because it's okay, just run through the story again. I think the game that I've mostly gone through New Game Plus is Borderlands 2. Just because you just carry your skills and you can go to different skill trees and so on and so forth. It doesn't add a story content or anything like that, but it does. The enemies get stronger. The enemies have different elemental resistances, and weapons are just higher level. You're just keep grinding that level, and until you just become the most badass thing ever, right? So I think Borderlands 2 does a good job in a sense of just carry progression and everything like that, but nothing like a story. I think the biggest, other than Chrono Trigger, I think the biggest thing that does this really well is Nier Automata. Where you have a bunch of different routes to it, and you kind of have to play three or four times. You haven't
really finished the game until you've beaten it 3 times, essentially.
That's what I hear.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's the same with Nier Replicant, the new game that came out too, where it's there's a whole bunch of different endings in that game too, and there's a reason to go back and play that. But yeah, so that goes back to more what I'm talking about, where there has to be a reason to go do that, unless again, if you're going to revisit a game, let's say you beat the game and then a year or two later you feel like replaying it and experiencing the story again, then I'm sure that's fine to play on New Game Plus. Yeah. But for me, again, to replay it right away or something like that, that's not something I usually like to do.
And so some RPGs that would like to have New Game Plus mode, I honestly, Ryan, I think all the games I'm thinking of right now has some form of New Game Plus.
Yeah.
They keep wanting you to do a New Game Plus in order for you to just keep on playing with the game and trying to get into the game. The only game I could think of that could tweak their New Game Plus just a little bit is actually Fire Emblem Three Houses. When I actually restart my New Game Plus to do a different route for the Fire Emblem game, you're kind of like a clean slate. I think you carry some sort of level of stats or everything, but you know, your characters are gone and everything like that, and it kind of sucks, actually. I would love to have like two different types of New Game Pluses, where one's like you're just an overpowered person and you could just trudge through the story as fast as you can with all your characters, all your skills, all your stats. I think that would just be a cool, crazy, wacky way of going through the game versus the hardcore, methodical game that actually went through my first playthrough. Mm-hmm. So I just wish the New Game Plus, instead of being tacked on and add-on, have a little bit more thought to it. Yeah. Have a little bit more twist. It doesn't necessarily need to be story driven or story content driven. Yeah. I think, but it's more system based. Have a little bit more behind it the second time around in order to justify that New Game Plus.
Like maybe the bosses, for example, either have like more hit points, or maybe they have like different abilities that they'll use in like New Game Plus, for example, to give you like an extra challenge, for example, like. I think there's a bunch of things you could do with that. And like, especially if you look at live service games and stuff like that now too, like they're just in infinite New Game Plus where it just goes on forever. Or my Assassin's Creed Odyssey example, where it gives you a New Game Plus option if you want to start from the very beginning, or you can continue playing forever and it just generates side quests for you once you beat the game. So it's just very silly. Also, I don't know if you played through all three routes in Fire Emblem Three Houses in New Game Plus though, but you get stupidly overpowered through like your third journey through New Game Plus because of how many points because what ends up happening is you can bank up all your these like play points essentially that you get every time you play through the game, and you can spend them to basically, like, by my third playthrough I had max on all of my weapon skills for my main character and all the classes
you get max on the weapons.
So like I would basically just steamroll the people with my Byleth, which is just ridiculous. But anyways, that's the end of the episode. But before we go, Garrett, plug Scout.
You can follow me on Twitter @BlandExplosion, and you can follow me on Twitch whenever I stream on a blue moon, twitch.tv/BlandExplosion. I'm going to do a lot of PSVG E3 related stuff. It looks like Square Enix and also the Nintendo E3 Direct reactions and all that type of stuff. So take a look forward to that, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, very nice. Most of that stuff you're going to see over twitch.tv/PSVG for most of that stuff as well.
Yes.
As for me, you can find me on Twitter @Ryan Turford. I'm also heavily involved in E3. Sean and I, we haven't really talked about what we're going to be doing for E3 publicly yet, but we're going to probably be streaming most of the press conferences. So you can definitely come hang out with us. We haven't decided where we're going to do that yet or when, but obviously we're going to have a schedule probably by the time you're listening to this. So you'll already kind of know what we're doing there. Also, you can find us, The RPG Cave, on Twitter @The RPG Cave. On YouTube, just search for The RPG Cave there, or on podcast services around the globe. So for Garrett Bland, I am Ryan Turford. This has been episode 4 of The RPG Cave, and we're out.
Bye-bye.